Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. In keeping with today's theme, which for me is very much about reflecting on the appropriate content, the appropriate trajectory, and the appropriate shape of the tripartite FTA negotiations, I don't want to get into much of the details surrounding the challenges, the obstacles, the processes as they've evolved thus far. I think we've already heard quite a lot about that this morning, and we will continue to do so throughout today. And by the end of today, I assume we will all be experts on the tripartite free trade agreement. Instead, what I want to focus on is what I perceive to be an important omission from the agenda, and that is the issue of investment. Now, I say, to me, it appears that this issue has been neglected in the agenda because I speak as someone who's not involved in the process. I do not know what's going on behind closed doors. All I have to go on is what's available to the public and what I hear from certain sources. Certainly, though, investment does not appear to be either part of the first phase or even the second phase of the tripartite free trade agreement negotiations. Now, why is this important? Well, if we take a step back and think about the rationale for the agreement itself, we must understand that an agreement to establish a free trade area is not an end in itself. The objective is not to conclude an agreement, go home, pat ourselves on the back and say, job well done. No. The agreement and the establishment of a tripartite free trade area is a mechanism. It's a means to an end. It's a means to various goals, goals such as industrial development, economic and social development, and basically increased prosperity for the people of the region. Now, in discussions around the tripartite free trade agreement, there seems to be a sense that what we're doing is we're creating a larger market, and what will follow will be economic development. Growth and development will just simply follow the creation of this larger market. Now, that may actually be what happens, but that's a very sloppy way of describing the process. Regional integration creates a favorable business environment. That's what it aims to do. It creates an arena in which trade is more open and where other dynamic benefits can assist and can serve to create an environment in which investment is attracted. But investment is absolutely crucial to this process. Without investment in the supply side capacity, so investment in human capital, in skills development, in technologies, in know-how, without this, there's no way to take advantage of this more conducive environment created through trade facilitation, through the removal of tariffs and non-tariff barriers. So even if we get all of that right, if there's no investment, local or foreign, then there aren't these goals, these objectives of growth and development that we're aiming for with this agreement. Now, in our region, there are two factors that are particularly relevant in this regard. The one is that there are very low levels of industrial development and economic diversification at the moment, and these have their causes in historical developments, but play into the fact that even if we did have open trade, we wouldn't necessarily be able to trade with one another or with the outside world, because we may simply not be able to produce the goods and services that other people want, that other countries, that other societies in the region and beyond want. Investment, again, implied but vitally important. Secondly, the region is characterized by low domestic savings. So not only are we talking about investment, but we're actually talking specifically, in most cases, about foreign investment, be it foreign in the sense of coming from other countries within the region or from beyond. And foreign investment in particular is going to be key to promoting industrial development and into achieving the goals that we're setting ourselves with this agreement, with the establishment of a tripartite free trade agreement. Now, the importance of investment is recognized in this whole process. In particular, the draft agreement in its preamble explicitly recognizes that cross-border investment should be one of the major areas of cooperation between the TFTA member states. Article 4 of the agreement highlights the liberalization of cross-border investment as one of the specific objectives of the agreement, while Article 24 commits member states to market the tripartite free trade area as a single investment area and to develop policies and strategies which promote cross-border investment. So the question then is why, given this recognition of the importance of investment, is investment not explicitly included in either of these two phases of negotiations? And why is there no discussion, at least from what I have heard, about the creation of a single investment area or a regional governance framework for investment to accompany a regional governance framework for trade? There are a number of benefits that could ensue from having such a framework. First, it could serve to promote increased investment. A regional investment agreement, if we want to call it that, could be used to open up specific sectors to investment, both intra-regional and from outside the region. It could serve to lower transaction costs, informational and other, again, making an environment that's more conducive to investment and more welcoming of investment. And certainly it would complement very nicely the other areas of reform that are being undertaken as part of this whole process. On that point, and not wanting to preempt Patrick's presentation later today, but just to say that in terms of a world in which international, global, or regional value chains are becoming increasingly important determinants of where products and services are produced and how they are traded, in such an environment, addressing investment alongside trade becomes imperative, right? You simply cannot address the one without the other and hope that you will have firms locating portions of their value chains in your country, in your region, and sharing their production processes with your economies. But again, I think Patrick will probably say quite a bit more about that later today. Third, a regional framework for investment governance could also serve as a mechanism to coordinate and to harmonize national level and REC level investment policies. This can be beneficial for a number of reasons itself. The first is obviously that it would serve to enhance this idea of the TFTA as a single investment area. And I think of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, as a regional bloc that has been very successful in this regard, in promoting itself as a regional investment destination. Another important role that a regional governance framework for investment can play is, in a sense, to tie the hands of domestic policymakers and to ensure that at the domestic or even at the REC level, countries do not engage in beggar-thy-neighbor policies. One example of where this may occur in terms of investment incentives is in the area of special economic zones or export processing zones in particular. Now, from the point of view of a single country, it's perfectly rational to try and use such incentives to attract investment to its territory. But if you have a situation where you have neighboring countries both trying to outdo each other with the incentives they're offering to investors, who many times would probably have chosen one of the two countries anyway, because from the sense that you get reading a lot of the literature on special economic zones and on investment incentives, in many cases it seems that these incentives are only important at the margins, that firms have already decided that they would like to invest, for instance, in East Africa. And it's only once they've made that decision do they then look at what are the particular incentives offered by Uganda, offered by Kenya. So in this way, when countries in a particular region engage in these kind of race to the bottom strategies, or these incentive-based bidding wars, they don't actually lead to more investment in the region as a whole. They simply lead to a transfer in a way of rents to the investor. By addressing this and other similar kinds of problems that can arise through using investment incentives in this way, a regional framework, if designed correctly, obviously, can also serve to promote the attraction of the right type of FDI. Because not all foreign investment is equal in terms of its effects, its ability to create linkages with domestic economies. Again, in sub-Saharan Africa, in our region, we have something of a history of attracting particular investments that don't really go anywhere. I think particularly of the Romatex example is a famous case of a firm coming in, taking advantage of incentives, and then basically leaving once they had exhausted those. And there are plenty of other anecdotal examples. So a regional framework that, in a sense, ties the hands at a little bit at the national level may actually serve to promote welfare and to promote gains at the regional level. And in this way, could also feed into this idea of creating a regional industrial policy, which I don't really want to get into. I've spoken before at previous conferences, and certainly there are a lot of questions around that, but certainly you can't really discuss a regional industrial policy unless there's some sort of harmonization and coordination in terms of the various investment policies involved. Another important rationale for a regional investment framework is, to quote Professor Erasmus, that such a framework can be a catalyst for necessary domestic reforms to improve competitiveness through, for example, the specification of best practice. Very, very importantly as well in our region, another benefit that can come simply from putting investment on the agenda could be that it could lead to increased interest by the private sector in the whole process. Again, in our region, a vitally important issue. We tend to have regional integration processes that are driven from the top down, very government-led, with only minimal involvement by various private sectors and private sector representatives. Perhaps putting an issue like investment on the agenda would address that in some small way, because certainly there would be firms and industries that have far more of an interest in the investment environment than the trade environment, or specifically than trade issues such as tariffs. And finally, another rationale is simply that everybody else is doing it. One of the lessons from the WTO's World Trade Report from 2011 was, which looked at the proliferation of preferential trade agreements around the world, and it's happened certainly in the last decade or two, was that it's not only developed countries that are engaging increasingly in these mega FTAs, but also developing. And aside from that, not only are they addressing traditional tariff issues and other traditional trade issues, they're also going and looking at behind the border issues, investment, services, intellectual property rights, all of which are kind of offered as a package in which to attract global value chains for one, and to create this encompassing environment that essentially promotes foreign investment. Of course, just because everybody else is doing something doesn't necessarily make it a good idea, but it suggests that perhaps if they all think there's some logic to it, we should at least consider it. And to conclude, ladies and gentlemen, I just want to make 4 brief points. The first is that while I've been talking about investment specifically, much of what I've said applies to these other new generation issues, trade in services, competition policy, intellectual property rights, and much of the same logic applies. The second concerns the level of ambition that we want from a tripartite free trade area. Certainly, if we are serious about this ambitious agenda, and if we really want to maximize the potential from such an agreement and from such from establishing a free trade area of this size and this scope, we would really have to include issues like investment, which are not on the agenda at all, as far as I'm aware, and issues like competition policy, like trade in services, which at least are on the agenda for phase 2. Third, from a global level, there's a lot of discussion about the appropriate level of investment governance, and a lot of sense that actually what would be best is if there was a multilateral investment agreement, a multilateral framework for investment governance. Now, obviously, from the point of view of countries in the region, we have limited ability to drive that process forward. But in a regional framework, we at least have the opportunity to create a framework which can speak specifically to the developmental needs of our region and of our economies. Finally, everything I've said is based on the assumption that a regional investment framework, be it a regional investment agreement, is both desirable, and I've made a few points as to why that might be the case, and secondly, feasible. Now, it certainly might be the case, and there may be good arguments as to why such an agreement, such a framework, is not actually desirable or is not actually feasible. It might be argued that investment policy should be best left to the REC level, where in fact investment agreements already exist, investment frameworks, at least on paper, specifically COMESA investment agreement and with the finance investment protocol under SADC. Now, if we were to leave it at that, a number of further questions would then be raised. Perhaps investment is one area where this idea of variable geometry might come into play. But is this the optimal form to address investment? Should we perhaps not be seeking to really create this single investment area to complement the single trade area? There are, of course, a host of further other issues relating to how these instruments themselves, the COMESA instrument and the SADC instrument, cohere with one another. But I'll leave that to a later discussion. I'd like to just leave it there. Thanks very much.